Wade Langston had grown weary of towns where every face held questions and every glance carried judgment. The dusty streets of Silver Creek had been no different, filled with merchants who counted his coins twice and children who whispered behind his back about the stranger with the haunted eyes. When Harrison Mills approached him outside the general store with talk of selling prime mountain land, Wade saw it as Providence answering his prayers for solitude. The transaction had been surprisingly swift. Mills seemed eager to close the deal, his hands shaking slightly as he counted the bills Wade pressed into his palm. "Beautiful piece of property," Mills had said, avoiding direct eye contact. "Most peaceful spot in 3 counties. Perfect for a man who wants to be left alone." There had been something in his voice, a nervous quality that Wade attributed to the natural anxiety of parting with family land. Looking back, he should have recognized it as guilt. Now, 3 days later, Wade guided his horse up the winding mountain path toward his new home, breathing air so clean it made his chest ache with unexpected emotion. Behind him lay months of running, of sleeping with one eye open in boarding houses and camps where strangers asked too many questions about his past. Ahead waited the promise of peace, of mornings without fear and nights without the need to check his back trail. The cabin came into view as he rounded a bend in the pine-lined trail, and Wade's first thought was that Mills had undersold the property's beauty. The structure sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering evergreens, with a clear stream bubbling just beyond the front porch. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and someone had taken obvious care to maintain the building's rustic charm. Wade had expected emptiness, dust-covered furniture, and the hollow feeling of an abandoned place. Instead, the scene before him spoke of active habitation, of someone who had made this place truly home. The woman on his front porch looked up as he approached, and Wade felt something shift in his chest at the sight of her. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon sunlight and eyes the color of deep forest pools. Her dress was simple but clean, mended in places but worn with dignity. What struck him most was her composure. She showed no surprise at his arrival, no embarrassment at being discovered on another person's property. Instead, she studied him with the calm intensity of someone who had been expecting exactly this moment. "You must be the new owner," she said, rising gracefully from the porch steps. Her voice carried the soft cadence of mountain folk, unhurried and thoughtful. She brushed dust from her worn skirt and extended her hand with the natural courtesy of frontier hospitality. "I'm Ivy Shepherd. I've been keeping this cabin ready." Wade dismounted, his mind racing as he tried to process the situation. The deed in his saddlebags gave him legal ownership of every timber and stone. Yet this woman spoke with the quiet authority of someone who belonged here. More unsettling was the way she looked at him, as if she were measuring something beyond his travel-stained appearance, as if his arrival fulfilled some long-held expectation she had been carrying. "Miss Shepherd," he said carefully, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at his side. "I bought this property fair and square from Harrison Mills. Paid full price with my own money. There's no mention of any family arrangements in the deed." He pulled the folded document from his jacket, holding it like evidence in a court of law. Ivy nodded as if she expected this exact response. "Harrison Mills." She spoke the name with something that might have been pity. "Did he tell you why he was selling? Why a man would part with the most beautiful piece of land in 3 counties for half what it's worth?" Her question hit Wade like a cold wind, crystallizing suspicions he had tried to ignore during the hasty transaction in Silver Creek. "There's something you need to know about this place," Ivy continued, settling back onto the porch step as if she had all the time in the world. "My family made a promise about this land. A promise I've been waiting 20 years to keep." The weight of secrets seemed to hang in the mountain air between them, and Wade felt the familiar sensation of standing at the edge of something that would change his life forever. Wade stared at the Woman who claimed to have been waiting 20 years, his hand instinctively moving toward the pistol at his side. The mathematics troubled him deeply. 20 years would place her promise back to when she was barely more than a child. Yet she spoke with the certainty of someone who had carried this burden through countless seasons of waiting. "Miss Shepherd," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the confusion churning in his chest. "I don't understand what kind of promise a child could make about land ownership. This deed says I own everything from the creek bed to the ridgeline." He gestured toward the document in his hands, seeking solid ground in a conversation that seemed to shift like mountain mist. Ivy's eyes never left his face as she spoke. "Harrison's father bought this land from mine 35 years ago. But there were conditions, agreements that weren't written down because they were matters of honor, not law." The way she emphasized honor struck Wade like a physical blow. He had come west to escape men who had no concept of the word, men who had destroyed his life in Missouri through lies and betrayal. The idea that he might have unknowingly become part of another deception made his stomach turn with familiar dread. "My father promised that one of his blood would always live on this land," Ivy continued, her voice taking on the quality of someone reciting sacred text. "That we would tend it, protect it, keep it safe until the right person came along. Someone worthy of what this place really offers." Wade felt the hairs on his neck rise at her words. The way she emphasized worthy suggested some kind of test, but he couldn't imagine what criteria a woman living alone in the mountains would use to judge his character. More troubling was her apparent certainty that he might be this worthy person when they had never met before this moment. Wade had spent months perfecting the art of remaining unremarkable, of blending into crowds and avoiding the kind of attention that might draw bounty hunters or vengeful families. Yet Ivy Shepherd seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed facade to something he wasn't sure he possessed anymore. "What exactly are you protecting here, Miss Shepherd?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. The question seemed to hang in the mountain air like smoke from the cabin's chimney, carrying implications he was only beginning to grasp. Ivy smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. Instead, it carried the weight of knowledge she had guarded alone for years. "That depends entirely on whether you're the man I've been waiting for." She stood and moved toward the cabin door, her hand resting on the weathered latch with possessive familiarity. "But I should warn you, Wade Langston. The last 3 men who tried to claim this place without understanding its true nature ... double quotes." She paused, her smile fading completely. A shadow seemed to gather in her forest green eyes. "They didn't fare well." The threat was delivered so calmly, with such matter-of-fact certainty, that Wade felt ice form in his veins despite the warm afternoon sun. This delicate-looking woman spoke of men's misfortune with the casual tone others might use to discuss the weather. Yet something in her manner suggested she was not boasting about violence, but simply stating facts about the mountain's harsh justice. Wade found himself studying Ivy's face for signs of madness or cruelty, but found only the steady gaze of someone who had learned to survive alone in unforgiving country. The contradiction between her gentle appearance and the steel in her voice created a tension he couldn't quite resolve. She seemed to embody the mountain itself, beautiful and welcoming on the surface, but capable of deadly consequences for those who underestimated its hidden dangers. "I think," Wade said slowly, choosing his words with the care of a man walking across thin ice, "that I'd like to understand exactly what kind of protection this land requires. And what happened to those 3 men who couldn't provide it?" His decision to stay and learn, rather than mount his horse and ride away, surprised him. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the recognition of kindred spirit in someone else who had been shaped by necessity into something harder than their appearance suggested. Ivy's hand tightened on the door latch, and for a moment, Wade saw vulnerability flicker across her features like sunlight through moving leaves. "Come inside, Wade Langston," she said softly. "Let me show you what Harrison Mills really sold you. Then you can decide if you're the man who's going to help me keep that 20-year-old promise, or if you're going to become another cautionary tale about the price of greed." Wade pushed past Ivy and stepped into the cabin, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. What he saw made him freeze in the doorway, every instinct screaming that he had walked into something far more complex than a simple property dispute. The place was immaculate, furnished with care and attention that spoke of years of devoted habitation. A woman's touch was evident everywhere, from the carefully arranged wildflowers on the rough-hewn table to the neatly folded quilts on the bed. This wasn't the empty shell he had expected to purchase. Every surface gleamed with recent cleaning. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, and a pot of stew simmered over the fire, filling the cabin with the rich aroma of mountain game and wild vegetables. Someone had not just lived here, but had made this place a true home, investing time and heart into every detail of frontier comfort. "You've been living here," Wade said, turning to face her. It wasn't an accusation, simply a statement of the obvious truth that Harrison Mills had somehow failed to mention during their transaction. "Since I was 16, Ivy replied, closing the door behind them with the soft familiarity of someone who had performed this action countless times. "After my father died and left me alone on the mountain." Wade walked to the stone fireplace, where a small fire crackled with fresh wood, providing both warmth and light to the cozy interior. Above the mantel hung 3 different hats, each belonging to a different man, each showing signs of hard use and sudden abandonment. He lifted one down, a black felt hat with a silver band, and examined the bullet hole that had torn through the crown like a grim signature. "The previous owners?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer would confirm his growing unease about this place and the woman who guarded it. Ivy moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the mountain air in her hair, the faint scent of pine and something uniquely her own. Her proximity sent an unexpected current through his body, an awareness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the strange attraction he was beginning to feel toward this enigmatic woman. "Thomas Barrett was the first," she said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting familiar history. "Came here 2 years after my father's death, claiming Mills had sold him the property. He was a hard man, used to taking what he wanted without asking permission." Wade set the hat back on its peg, his attention now focused entirely on her story. The casual way she spoke of Barrett's fate suggested violence, but her steady voice betrayed no fear or remorse. "Barrett tried to force me off the land," she continued, settling into a chair by the fire as if preparing for a long tale. "Said a woman had no business living alone in the mountains. Said I was probably luring men to their deaths for their money and belongings." A slight smile crossed her lips, but it held no warmth, only the grim satisfaction of someone who had proved such assumptions wrong. He wasn't entirely wrong about the deaths part. The admission should have alarmed Wade, should have sent him backing toward the door with his hand on his weapon. Instead, he found himself stepping closer, drawn by the contradiction between her delicate appearance and the steel in her voice. There was something about Ivy Shepherd that called to a part of him he had thought long dead, the part that recognized genuine strength when he encountered it. "What happened to Barrett?" Wade asked, though he suspected the answer would only deepen the mystery surrounding this woman and her mountain sanctuary. "He fell," Ivy said simply, her eyes meeting his with unwavering directness. "The mountain paths can be treacherous for men who don't respect the land or the people who know it best." Understanding passed between them like a current of electricity, and Wade nodded slowly, grasping the truth she left unspoken. Barrett hadn't just fallen. He had been helped along his way by someone who knew every dangerous trail and hidden cliff face on this unforgiving mountain. And the other 2 hats? Wade gestured toward the remaining memorials above the mantel, each one a testament to men who had underestimated the quiet strength of the woman before him. Ivy moved to the window, gazing out at the peaks that surrounded their small valley like protective sentinels. Similar stories. Men who came with legal papers and cruel intentions. She turned back to face him, her eyes searching his face for something he couldn't identify. But you're different, aren't you, Wade? You didn't come here to take. You came here to hide. Wade felt the weight of Ivy's perception settle on him like a heavy coat, uncomfortable, but somehow fitting. She had seen through his careful facade in minutes, reading the truth he had hoped to bury along with his past in the Missouri dirt. He turned away from her penetrating gaze, pretending to examine the cabin's sturdy construction while gathering the courage to respond to her unnervingly accurate assessment. Running and hiding aren't the same thing, he said finally, running his fingers along the smooth wooden walls that spoke of craftsmanship and care. Sometimes a man just needs space to think without people asking questions he's not ready to answer. Ivy moved closer, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor, and Wade became acutely aware of her presence beside him. What kind of questions are you avoiding, Wade? The directness of her inquiry should have angered him, should have triggered the defensive responses he had perfected during months of evasion. Instead, it felt like relief washing over him in cool mountain air. For too long, he had carried the burden of his secrets alone, deflecting curiosity with vague answers and quick departures from towns that grew too familiar. Here, with this strange woman who guarded her own mysteries behind forest green eyes, he felt an unexpected urge to unburden himself of the weight he had been carrying. I killed 2 men in Missouri, he said, the words falling from his lips before he could stop them. The confession hung in the cabin air like smoke, heavy with implications and consequences. They deserved it, but their families had money and influence, the kind that buys judges and sheriff badges. Ivy nodded as if he had confirmed something she already suspected, her expression showing neither shock nor judgment. Self-defense, she said, and it wasn't a question. They called it murder. Wade's hands clenched into fists at the memory, muscles tensing with remembered rage and frustration. Samuel and Marcus Whitmore, brothers who thought every woman in 3 counties belonged to them, whether she agreed or not. They cornered a girl named Helen outside the church social, and I couldn't stand by and watch. His voice grew rough with the memory of that terrible night, when his sense of right and wrong had collided with the harsh realities of frontier justice. I tried talking first, offered to escort the girl home safe. The Whitmores didn't appreciate being told no by a ranch hand who knew his place. Wade laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the cozy warmth of the cabin. Samuel drew on me first, but Marcus was faster than I expected. If I hadn't been lucky with my shot, Ivy placed her hand on his arm, the touch sending an unexpected current through his body that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with human connection he had thought lost forever. Her fingers were calloused from hard work but gentle in their pressure, offering comfort without judgment. Lucky isn't the word I'd use, she said softly. Skilled, maybe. Determined. A man who protects the innocent isn't lucky. Wade, he's necessary. Her words carried the weight of someone who understood the burden of doing what was right regardless of consequences. And Wade felt something ease in his chest that had been tight for months. He looked down at her hand on his arm, marveling at how such a simple touch could quiet the storm that had raged in his heart since that night in Missouri. The judge didn't see it that way. Neither did the sheriff who owed his position to Whitmore money. So you left, Ivy said, understanding filling her voice like sunlight breaking through clouds. I ran, Wade corrected, the admission tasting bitter but somehow necessary. Took my horse, my guns, and what money I had saved. Figured I'd find someplace remote enough that Whitmore influence couldn't reach. He paused, studying her face for signs of disgust or fear, but found only compassion and something deeper that made his pulse quicken. Ivy smiled, and this time the expression reached her eyes, transforming her entire face with warmth and acceptance. You chose well. This mountain has a way of protecting people who deserve protection. She moved toward the cabin door, pausing with her hand on the latch to look back at him. Would you like to see what you really bought, Wade Langston? The reason my family made that promise? Ivy led Wade along a narrow path that wound behind the cabin and up into the dense pine forest, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew every rock and root by heart. The trail was barely visible, worn smooth by years of careful use rather than heavy traffic, and Wade found himself studying the graceful way her body navigated the challenging terrain with the sure-footedness of a mountain cat. Most men who come here never see past the cabin, she said over her shoulder, a voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. They look at the building, measure the cleared land, count the trees they could cut for timber. They never think to explore what lies beyond their immediate understanding. Wade followed her higher into the mountains, noting how the air grew thinner and cleaner with each step they climbed. The sounds of civilization faded completely, replaced by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of hawks circling overhead in the endless blue sky. This was the kind of solitude he had dreamed of during those desperate nights fleeing Missouri, and he felt his soul beginning to settle for the first time in months. After 20 minutes of steady climbing, Ivy stopped at what appeared to be a solid wall of granite rising like a fortress from the mountain slope. But as Wade approached, he realized she stood beside a narrow opening in the rock face, barely wide enough for a person to pass through sideways. The entrance was so cleverly concealed that he would have walked past it a dozen times without noticing its existence. "This is what my father protected," she said, gesturing toward the hidden entrance with reverence in her voice. "What his father protected before him. What I've been protecting since I was old enough to understand its value." Her words carried the weight of generations, of promises passed down through bloodlines and sealed with sacred trust. Wade squeezed through the opening behind her, the rough granite scraping against his shoulders as he navigated the narrow passage. He emerged into a natural cathedral carved from living rock, and what he saw took his breath away with its impossible beauty. Sunlight streamed through gaps high above, illuminating a scene that seemed crafted by divine hands rather than natural forces. A crystal-clear pool of water filled the center of the hidden chamber, fed by an underground spring that bubbled up from depths unknown. The sound of flowing water created a peaceful melody that echoed off the cavern walls. But it wasn't the water that made Wade gasp in amazement. The walls themselves glittered with veins of silver so pure they seemed to glow in the filtered sunlight. This wasn't just traces or small deposits like he had seen in played-out mining claims. These were thick seams that ran throughout the entire chamber, more precious metal than most men would encounter in 10 lifetimes of hard labor. Wade had seen enough mining operations during his travels to recognize wealth when he encountered it, and this hidden cavern contained a fortune beyond his wildest imagination. "My God," he whispered, running his fingers along one of the silver veins with trembling hands. "This is more money than a man could spend in several lifetimes. Several fortunes," Ivy agreed, her voice soft with the weight of responsibility she had carried alone for so long. "Enough to buy entire territories. Enough to make whoever controls it one of the wealthiest people in the country." She moved to the edge of the pool, kneeling to cup the pure water in her hands like a sacred offering. "It's also enough to bring every greedy man for 1,000 miles running when word gets out," she continued. And Wade understood immediately why her family had made promises about protecting this land. In the wrong hands, knowledge of this silver deposit would transform their peaceful mountain valley into a hellish mining camp filled with desperate men willing to kill for a share of the wealth. "The promise," he said, the pieces finally falling into place like tumbling rocks finding their natural resting place. This wasn't just about land ownership or family traditions. This was about preserving something precious from the corruption that followed easy wealth. Ivy nodded, her eyes reflecting the silver light from the walls as she looked at him with hope and fear mingled in equal measure. To keep this secret until someone proved worthy of the responsibility. Someone who would protect it rather than exploit it. Someone who understands that some things are more valuable than money. Wade felt the weight of her words settling on his shoulders, like a mantle of responsibility he had never asked for, but somehow knew he was meant to bear. But before he could respond to the trust she was offering, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the valley below, shattering the peace of their hidden sanctuary with the harsh reality of the outside world. Ivy pressed herself against the cavern wall, her face draining of color as the sound of multiple horses grew louder in the valley below. Wade moved instinctively to shield her, drawing his pistol in one smooth motion as he peered through the narrow entrance toward the cabin they had left behind. The methodical approach of the riders sent ice through his veins as recognition dawned. "How many men know about this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he counted distinct hoofbeats echoing off the valley walls. "No one living," Ivy replied, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear despite the brave words. Barrett suspected something valuable was hidden up here, but he died before he could prove it. The others never got close enough to matter. Wade counted at least 6 distinct sets of hoofbeats echoing through the mountain air. Too many for coincidence and too organized for casual travelers. His blood ran cold as he recognized the methodical pattern of their approach, the disciplined spacing that spoke of men who hunted other men for money rather than justice. These weren't drifters or prospectors, but professional trackers, the kind who followed cold trails across state lines and never gave up once they caught a scent. "They're not here for the silver," he said grimly, holstering his weapon as the terrible truth settled over him like a suffocating blanket. "They're here for me." Ivy grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his sleeve as understanding dawned in her forest green eyes. "The Whitmore family," she whispered, and it wasn't a question, but a statement of inevitable consequence. Wade nodded, already backing toward the hidden chamber's depths while pulling Ivy with him. "They must have tracked me to Silver Creek, found out about the land I purchased from Mills. Probably paid good money for information about where Wade Langston might be hiding." The sound of voices drifted up from the cabin below, harsh and demanding, too distant for individual words, but unmistakably threatening in tone. He watched. Ivy's face transformed from fear to something harder, more dangerous, as the reality of invasion settled over her. "They're in my home," she said, her voice carrying the same cold edge he had heard when she spoke of Barrett's fate on the mountain trails. "Our home," Wade corrected without thinking, then froze as he realized what he had said. The possessive word had slipped out naturally, as if he had already accepted that this place belonged to both of them, as if their fates had become intertwined in the space of a single afternoon. The implications of that mental shift would have to wait for later consideration. Ivy's eyes widened at his correction, but before she could respond, a man's voice bellowed from the valley, the words carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Wade Langston, we know you're up there somewhere. Samuel Whitmore sends his regards." Wade's jaw clenched as the name hit him like a physical blow. Samuel Whitmore was supposed to be dead, shot through the chest during their confrontation outside the church social in Missouri. Either he had survived somehow, defying Wade's certainty about his marksmanship, or his family was using his name to add insult to their vengeance. Either way, the message was clear. This wasn't just about money anymore, but about family honor and blood debt. "There's another way out of here," Ivy whispered, pointing toward a narrow crack in the far wall that Wade hadn't noticed in his amazement at the silver deposits. "It leads to the north face of the mountain. We could disappear into the high country until they give up and move on." Wade studied her face. seeing determination replacing fear as she prepared to abandon everything she had, built to help a man she had known for less than a day. The sacrifice implicit in her offer struck him harder than any physical blow could have managed. "You don't have to run from my troubles, Ivy," he said, though even as he spoke the words he knew they rang hollow. His troubles had already become hers the moment those riders entered the valley. Whether she chose to flee with him or stayed to face whatever consequences his presence had brought to her mountain sanctuary, she moved closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body despite the cool air of the cavern, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "This mountain has protected my family for 3 generations," she said with quiet certainty. "It's going to protect you too." Below them, the sound of splintering wood suggested the hunters had grown tired of waiting for answers and had begun tearing apart the cabin in search of clues. Wade pressed his back against the silver-veined wall, pulling Ivy close as the sounds of destruction echoed up from their violated sanctuary, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what he was fighting for. Wade pressed his back against the silver-veined wall, pulling Ivy close as the sounds of destruction echoed up from the cabin below. The hunters were methodically tearing apart everything she had built, everything that represented years of solitary survival on this unforgiving mountain. Each crash of splintering wood felt like a personal assault on the sanctuary they had both begun to consider home. "I'm sorry," he whispered against her hair, breathing in the scent of pine and wildflowers that seemed to be part of her very being. "They're destroying your home because of me." Ivy tilted her face up toward his, and Wade found himself staring into eyes that held depths he was only beginning to understand. "A home is more than wooden walls and furniture," she said softly, her breath warm against his cheek. "It's the people who matter to you, the places where you feel safe to be yourself, the intimacy of their position." Pressed together in the silver-lit cavern while danger prowled below, created a tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the connection growing between them. Wade became acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, the rise and fall of her breathing, the way her fingers still clung to his hand as if he were her anchor in a storm. "Ivy," he began, but she placed her free hand against his chest, silencing him with gentle pressure while she listened to something he couldn't yet detect. "Do you hear that?" she whispered urgently. Wade strained his ears and caught what she had noticed first. The voices below were growing closer, no longer contained to the cabin, but moving up the mountain path. The hunters had found the trail that led to their hidden sanctuary. How long before they reached the entrance? He asked, his mind already racing through possibilities and options, none of them particularly promising against 6 armed men. 10 minutes. Maybe less if they're experienced trackers. Ivy moved toward the narrow crack in the back wall, gesturing for him to follow. "But there's something you need to understand before we run." Wade hesitated, caught between the urgent need to escape and the gravity in her voice that suggested whatever she was about to tell him would change everything once again. "What?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew what moral choice she was about to lay before him. "If we leave through that passage, we'll emerge on the far side of the mountain. We'll be safe, but we can never come back." Her eyes reflected the silver light like captured starlight, beautiful and haunting in equal measure. "The hunters will find this cavern eventually. They'll strip the mountain bare and destroy everything my family protected for 3 generations. The choice she was offering hit Wade like a physical blow to his chest. Run and survive, but abandon the promise her family had kept through decades of hardship and sacrifice. Stay and fight impossible odds to protect a secret that wasn't even his birthright to defend. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a yoke he had never asked to bear. "There's a third option," he said, an idea forming as he spoke. "Dangerous, but possibly their only real chance. We make them think they found what they came for." Ivy frowned. not immediately understanding his meaning. But Wade was already moving toward one of the silver veins, drawing his knife to scrape loose a handful of the precious metal. The plan was taking shape in his mind with crystalline clarity born of desperation and necessity. They're here for me, but they're greedy men underneath everything else. If they think they've stumbled onto something valuable enough to make them rich beyond their dreams, they'll forget about bounty money and focus on the silver, and follow us away from the main deposit, Ivy finished, her eyes widening as she grasped his plan with the quick intelligence he was learning to admire. Her face lit up with hope and something that might have been pride in his quick thinking. Exactly. We let them find enough to whet their appetite, then lead them away from here into country where we have the advantage. Wade pocketed the silver flakes, already mentally mapping the treacherous terrain he had noticed on his approach to the valley. They'll follow the promise of easy wealth, and we disappear into the high country until they give up the chase or make fatal mistakes. Ivy stepped closer, her hand coming up to rest against his cheek with a tenderness that made his heart skip in his chest. The gesture was so trusting, so full of faith in his ability to protect what mattered to both of them, that Wade felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. "You're willing to risk your life to protect my family's promise," she said with wonder in her voice, as if she couldn't quite believe that such honor still existed in the world. Before he could answer, the sound of boots scraping against rock echoed from the cavern entrance, and they realized with growing dread that the hunters had found them sooner than expected. Wade pressed the silver flakes into Ivy's palm and whispered urgently, "When I step out there, you slip through the back passage and circle around. They'll be focused on me." But Ivy shook her head with the stubborn determination he was learning was as much a part of her character as her gentle exterior. "I'm not leaving you to face 6 armed men alone," she whispered back, her fingers closing around the precious metal like a talisman against the danger approaching their sanctuary. Wade pressed the silver flakes into Ivy's palm as the sound of boots grew louder, echoing off the cavern walls like approaching thunder. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his mind remained clear with the deadly calm that had kept him alive during that terrible night in Missouri. This time, however, he wasn't just fighting for his own survival, but for something infinitely more precious. "Trust me," he whispered to Ivy, then stepped into the silver-lit chamber with his hands raised in apparent surrender. The gesture was calculated to buy time and lull his enemies into overconfidence, but it felt like walking into the mouth of a wolf. Well, drawled a familiar voice that made Wade's blood turn to ice in his veins. "Wade Langston, as I live and breathe." Marcus Whitmore stepped into the cavern's ethereal glow, and Wade saw with shock that the man he thought he had killed in Missouri stood very much alive before him. A vicious scar ran from Marcus's left ear to the corner of his mouth, where Wade's bullet had torn through flesh and bone, but the wound had healed crooked, giving his face a permanent sneer of hatred. "Hello, Marcus," Wade said with forced calm, though his mind raced with the implications of Marcus's survival. "You're looking well for a dead man," Marcus smiled, the expression twisted by his scarred features into something grotesque and threatening. "Takes more than a lucky shot to put down a Whitmore," he said, gesturing to his 5 companions with casual arrogance. Each man bore the hard look of professional killers, men who would follow orders without question if the price was right. "But I didn't come all this way just for revenge," Marcus continued, his eyes sweeping the silver-veined walls with unmistakable avarice. "Imagine my surprise when we tracked you to this little hideout and discovered what you've been protecting." Wade's heart sank as he realized his plan was working too well. Marcus had immediately grasped the value of what surrounded them, but his intelligence made him far more dangerous than a simple revenge seeker would have been. "Quite a claim you've staked out here, Langston," Marcus said, running his fingers along one of the silver veins with proprietary satisfaction. "Must have cost you everything you had to buy this mountain." "It did," Wade replied truthfully, though the words carried meanings. Marcus couldn't possibly understand. A sound like falling pebbles echoed from the back of the cavern, followed by a woman's gasp that carried clearly in the chamber's acoustics. Marcus's attention snapped toward the noise with predatory focus, and Wade saw Ivy's silhouette disappearing through the hidden crack in the wall. "Stop her!" Marcus barked, and two of his men lunged toward the back passage, but Wade stepped sideways, blocking their path with his body. "Let her go," Wade said, his voice carrying deadly calm. "She's just a local girl who was scared by your arrival." Marcus laughed coldly, the sound echoing off the silver walls like the cry of a carrion bird. "Local girl carrying a handful of raw silver ore? She's your partner in this little mining operation, isn't she?" Wade's mind raced as his carefully laid plan began to crumble around him like loose shale. Marcus had seen what Wade hoped he wouldn't notice, but perhaps there was still a way to salvage the situation and protect both Ivy and the secret she had guarded for so long. "She knows these mountains better than anyone," Wade said, allowing desperation to creep into his voice as if he were making a last-ditch bargain. "If you want to find the main vein, you'll need her alive and cooperative." Marcus studied Wade's face for a long moment, his scarred features twisted in thought as he weighed the value of immediate revenge against potential wealth beyond imagination. Finally, he nodded to his remaining men with the cold calculation of a natural predator. "Follow her, but don't hurt her yet," he ordered. "We might need what's in her head to find the mother lode." As the hunters squeezed through the narrow passage in pursuit of Ivy, Wade realized with growing horror that he had just sent the woman he was falling in love with straight into mortal danger. The plan that was supposed to protect her had instead marked her as a valuable asset to be captured and used. Wade waited until the last of Marcus's men disappeared through the passage, their voices echoing faintly from the hidden tunnel beyond. Then he moved with the deadly speed that had kept him alive in Missouri, drawing his pistol and pressing the barrel against Marcus's spine before the scarred man could react. "Your friends just made a fatal mistake," Wade said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man who had already killed and was prepared to do so again. Marcus tensed but didn't turn around, recognizing the professional competence in Wade's tone. "What mistake would that be, Langston?" "Following a woman who's lived on this mountain her entire life into terrain they don't know." Wade's voice carried grim satisfaction as distant sounds began to echo from the passage. "That tunnel doesn't lead to an escape route, Marcus. It leads to a 100-foot drop onto sharp rocks." The sound of men shouting in alarm echoed from somewhere beyond the cavern walls, followed by screams that cut off abruptly as gravity and stone delivered their harsh judgment. Wade felt no satisfaction in the deaths, but he felt no regret either. Those men had come here to kill him and exploit what Ivy's family had protected for generations. Marcus spun around with a snarl of rage, his hand moving toward his weapon, but Wade's fist connected with his jaw before he could draw. The impact sent Marcus crashing into the silver-veined wall, where he slumped to the cavern floor, unconscious but breathing. "Wade." Ivy's voice called from the main entrance, filled with concern and relief. "Are you safe?" "It's over," Wade called back, then knelt beside Marcus to check his pulse. Still alive, but he would wake with more than just a headache when Wade finished securing him. Ivy appeared in the entrance, her dress torn and dirty from navigating the treacherous passage, but her eyes bright with the fierce satisfaction of someone who had defended her home successfully. "The passage leads to a ledge overlooking the North Valley," she explained. "I showed them the way down." Her smile held no remorse for the men who had chosen greed over caution, and Wade found himself once again amazed by the steel beneath her gentle exterior. This woman had survived alone on an unforgiving mountain for nearly a decade, and she had learned lessons about survival that civilized society never taught. Together, they bound the unconscious Marcus and dragged him from the sacred cavern that had nearly become his tomb. An hour later, they left him tied securely to a sturdy pine tree halfway down the mountain trail, with enough water to last until the next travelers found him. If he's smart, Wade said as they walked back toward the cabin, he'll head back to Missouri and tell everyone that Wade Langston died in a mining accident. If he's not smart, well, double quotes, he shrugged, leaving the implications unspoken. The cabin stood damaged but repairable, and Wade had already begun mentally cataloging what supplies they would need to restore it to its former warmth. As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he found himself working alongside Ivy to clean up the destruction the hunters had left behind. "So what happens now?" Ivy asked as they settled together on the front porch, sharing a simple meal and watching the stars emerge in the crystal-clear mountain air. Wade took her hand, marveling at how perfectly her fingers fit between his own. How right it felt to sit beside her in the gathering darkness. "Now I keep the promise your family made," he said quietly. "We keep it together, if you'll have a fugitive-turned-mountain guardian as a partner." Ivy's smile outshone the emerging stars, transforming her entire face with joy and something deeper that made Wade's heart skip in his chest. The promise was to protect this place until the right person came along, she said, lifting their joined hands to press a gentle kiss to his knuckles. Someone worthy of the responsibility. She leaned against his shoulder, and Wade felt the last of his restless, wandering spirit settle into perfect stillness. "I think we found him." Wade pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of pine and wildflowers that would forever remind him of the day his life truly began. He had come to this mountain seeking solitude and found something infinitely more valuable. He had found home, purpose, and a woman strong enough to stand beside him against whatever challenges the future might bring. The silver would remain hidden, protected by two hearts that understood some treasures were worth more than wealth. And in the growing darkness of their mountain sanctuary, Wade Langston finally found the peace he had been searching for since that terrible night in Missouri when honor had forced him to choose between justice and safety. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnessing the birth of a love strong enough to guard secrets and brave enough to face whatever storms might come to their mountain paradise. The promise had been kept, and a new chapter of protection and devotion had begun in the silver-veined heart of the mountain that had chosen them both. The end.